When Edinburgh constables broke down the door of Professor Alister Finch's private laboratory at 3 o'clock in the morning on March 15, 1855, the first thing that hit them was the smell, not formaldehyde, not the chemical preservatives they expected in an anatomy professor's workspace. In the center of the room stood a long dissection table, and hunched over it was Professor Alister Finch. His back was to them. He was eating something with his hands, tearing at it with an urgency that made Pharaoh's stomach turn. The sound, wet, desperate, echoed in the stone-walled room. "Professor Finch?" Sergeant Reed called out. "Sir, we need you to step away from the table." Finch froze. For a long moment, he remained perfectly still. Then, slowly, he turned. His face was smeared with blood and grease. His fingers, long, elegant surgeon's fingers, were dark with it. His eyes, when they met the constable's lantern light, were wild, fevered. But behind the wildness was something else. Relief. "Thank God you've come," Finch whispered. His voice cracked. "I tried to stop. I swear I tried. But I couldn't." Macready raised his lantern higher, and the light fell fully on the dissection table. The body was fresh. A man, perhaps 30 years old, partially consumed. "Professor Alister Finch?" Sergeant Reed said, his voice shaking despite his attempt at authority. "You are under arrest for—" Finch's expression shifted. The relief vanished, replaced by something darker. Rage. "You shouldn't have come alone," he said quietly. That's when they heard it. Movement in the shadows behind the shelves of specimen jars. 3 figures emerged into the lamplight. Young men, students by the look of their clothing. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollow, and their mouths, all 3 of them, were stained dark with something the constables didn't want to identify. One of them was still chewing. Macready's hand went to his truncheon. "What in God's name?" Finch smiled then. A terrible, knowing smile. I wasn't the only one who couldn't stop. But to understand how Professor Alister Finch, a respected Cambridge-educated anatomist, a published researcher, a man trusted with shaping young minds, became Edinburgh's most disturbing criminal, we need to go back. Back to a time when he was still the man everyone admired. Back to before the hunger began. September 1853. 18 months before the constables would find him in that laboratory, Professor Alister Finch was considered one of Scotland's finest anatomical minds. He was 42 years old, tall and lean, with sharp features and wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him a scholarly, almost severe appearance. His lectures at the Edinburgh Medical College were standing room only. Students competed for positions in his anatomy theatre, where Finch's dissections were less demonstrations and more performances. Precise, elegant, mesmerizing. Brilliant, his colleagues called him. Revolutionary, said the medical. Journals that published his papers, the Edinburgh Medical Quarterly, had featured his research on muscular deterioration in cadavers. The Lancet had praised his comparative anatomy work. He'd been invited to lecture at the Royal Society of Edinburgh, an honour reserved for the academic elite. Finch had never married. He lived alone in a modest townhouse on Surgeon Square, within walking distance of the medical college. His life was his work. Students who studied under him reported that he seemed to need little sleep, often working in his laboratory until dawn. He had a particular intensity, one former student, Edward Whitmore, later recalled. When he looked at a body, a cadaver, it was like he was trying to see past the flesh itself. Like he was searching for something deeper, some truth the rest of us couldn't perceive. Finch's specialty was physiological limits. How much trauma could the human body endure before failure? How did starvation affect tissue composition? What were the measurable differences between a body that died quickly versus one that died slowly? His questions were always intense. Professor Finch, a student once asked during a lecture, why do you focus so much on the extremes, on suffering and survival? Finch had paused, scalpel in hand, and looked at the young man for a long moment. Because, he'd said quietly, the truth about human nature is never found in comfort. It's found in desperation, in the moments when civility is stripped away and all that remains is the animal beneath. Some students found this philosophy fascinating, others found it unsettling, but no one could deny his expertise. Finch's dissections were flawless. His anatomical knowledge was encyclopedic. He could identify the smallest muscle, trace the path of the most obscure nerve, explain the function of structures other anatomists overlooked. He was respected, admired, trusted. What no one knew, what Finch himself barely understood at the time, was that beneath his academic brilliance, something had always been different. He'd always been drawn to questions others avoided. He'd always felt a strange disconnect between himself and other people, a sense that he was observing humanity from the outside, studying it rather than truly being part of it. He'd always wondered what separated man from beast, and whether that separation was as definitive as everyone believed. In the autumn of 1853, Finch received a new shipment of cadavers for the anatomy theatre. The college had arrangements with the city morgue, unclaimed bodies, criminals who'd been executed, paupers who died with no family to bury them. The bodies arrived preserved in formaldehyde. Ready for dissection, Finch logged them carefully. A middle-aged woman, cause of death, consumption. An elderly man, cause of death, heart failure. A younger man, perhaps 25, cause of death, hanging. He'd been convicted of theft. It was this last body that would change everything. Finch began his preparations on the evening of October 3rd, 1853. He worked alone, as he often did. The anatomy theatre was empty, the students long gone. Just Finch and the silence and the body on the table before him. He made his first incision, and that's when the thought appeared. A thought so strange, so unbidden that Finch actually paused, scalpel in hand, and wondered where it had come from. What does it taste like? He shook his head, dismissing it. A morbid curiosity, nothing more. The kind of dark humor anatomists sometimes developed as a defense mechanism against the grim nature of their work. He continued the dissection, but the thought wouldn't leave. What does human flesh taste like? Finch tried to focus on his work, on the careful separation of muscle layers, the identification of fascia, the exposure of the thoracic cavity. But his hands felt strange, not quite steady, and the thought kept returning, more insistent now. He'd read accounts, of course. Survival cannibalism. The Donner Party, trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains in 1847, forced to consume their dead to survive. The wreck of the Essex, the whaling ship destroyed by a whale in 1820, where survivors resorted to drawing lots to determine who would be killed and eaten. These were documented cases, historical facts. Finch had read them with academic interest, noting the psychological aftermath, the physical effect, the way survivors described the experience. But he'd never truly wondered about the physical reality of it. Until now, Finch set down his scalpel. He looked at the body before him, a young man who died for stealing bread. Unclaimed, unmourned, his body given to medical science because no one else wanted it. No one would know, the thought whispered. No one would ever know. Finch removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. He was tired, that was all. Working too many late nights, not getting enough sleep. His mind was playing tricks on him. He replaced his spectacles and picked up the scalpel again. And that's when it happened. A simple accident. The kind that happened to anatomists occasionally, despite all their training and care. The blade slipped. It cut across Finch's left index finger just above the knuckle. Not deep, but enough to bleed, enough to sting. Finch's immediate instinctive reaction was to put the finger in his mouth to stop the bleeding. To ease the pain, a completely normal response, but his finger had been touching the cadaver's tissue. And in that moment, that single, thoughtless moment, Professor Alister Finch tasted human flesh for the first time. It was barely anything, a trace amount mixed with his own blood. But it was enough. He froze, fingers still in his mouth, as his mind processed what had just happened. The taste was strange. Not unpleasant exactly. Metallic from his own blood, yes, but underneath that was something else. Something that shouldn't have registered as distinctive at all, but somehow did. Finch slowly removed his finger from his mouth. He stared at the body on the table, and he felt something shift inside him, something fundamental and terrible. A door had opened, and he knew with horrible certainty that he would never be able to close it again. For 3 days, Finch tried to forget. He threw himself into his teaching. He conducted lectures with his usual precision. He met with students, reviewed their work, maintained his reputation as the brilliant, dedicated Professor Finch everyone knew. But at night, alone in his townhouse, the thought returned. What would it really taste like? Not an accident, not a trace. But deliberately, consciously, he told himself it was scientific curiosity, nothing more than that. Anatomists studied every other aspect of human physiology. Why not this? Why was this the one area that remained unexplored, undocumented, taboo? The Donner Party survivors had reported that the meat was similar to beef, but finer textured. The Essex survivors had said it was dark, like venison. But these accounts were fragmented, recorded by people in extreme distress, hardly reliable from a scientific standpoint. What would a controlled observation reveal? On the evening of October 6, 1853, Finch returned to his laboratory. The body from 3 nights earlier was still there, partially dissected, preserved in the cold stone room. Finch had locked the door behind him. No students, no colleagues. Just him and the corpse, and the question he couldn't escape. He stood at the dissection table for a long time, not moving. This was madness. This was a violation of every moral boundary, every ethical standard, every law of civilized society. But it was also, he told himself, an opportunity for knowledge, for understanding something fundamental about human nature that no one else had dared to study objectively. He was a scientist. Scientists pursued truth, even uncomfortable truth, even forbidden truth. Finch took his scalpel and carefully removed a small section of tissue from the cadaver's thigh, perhaps 2 inches square, no more than that. A sample, just a sample. His hands were shaking. He'd prepared a small spirit lamp, the kind used for heating instruments. He lit it, found a clean metal dish, placed the tissue sample in the dish, and held it over the flame. The smell as it cooked made him feel ill. But he didn't stop. When the tissue was cooked through, grey-brown, slightly charred at the edges, Finch removed it from the heat. He set it on his dissection tray. He stared at it for a long moment. Last chance to stop. Last chance to dispose of this and forget the whole thing. But he knew he wouldn't stop. Couldn't stop. The compulsion had him now, complete and undeniable. Professor Alister Finch picked up the piece of cooked human flesh, and he ate it. The taste was not what he'd expected, cooked plain with no seasoning. From a cadaver that had been dead for days and preserved in formaldehyde, it was tough and bitter and chemical tainted. But underneath all that, he could detect what it would have tasted like: fresh, lean, slightly metallic. Not so different from other meats, but with a distinct quality he couldn't quite define. Something that his brain recognized on an instinctive level as different, as forbidden. Finch swallowed. He stood there in his laboratory alone, waiting to feel horror at what he'd done, waiting for disgust, for shame, for the moral revulsion that any decent human being should feel. But instead, he felt something else entirely. Curiosity. What would it taste like fresh, without the chemical preservation? What would different parts of the body taste like How would it compare if properly prepared? And underneath the curiosity, something darker, satisfaction. Not from the taste itself, that had been mediocre at best, but from the act, from the crossing of the boundary, from doing something no one else dared to do, from being the only person in that room who knew what he'd just done. Finch cleaned his instruments. He locked the laboratory and went home. He tried to sleep but couldn't. His mind was racing, filled with questions and observations, and a creeping awareness that something fundamental had changed in him. He'd expected to feel like a monster. Instead, he felt more alive than he had in years. The next day, he conducted a lecture on the muscular system. 50 students watching as he demonstrated the layers of the human thigh, explaining the function of each muscle group. And the entire time, he was thinking, I know what that tastes like.
I know, and none of you do. I've crossed a line you can't even imagine crossing. It gave him a strange sense of power, of secret knowledge. He told himself it had been a one-time experiment, an aberration.
He'd satisfied his curiosity, and now he would return to normal. But that night, alone again, the thought returned. What about a fresher specimen? The cadavers that came to the anatomy theatre had been dead for days, sometimes weeks. They were preserved chemically. Any true scientific observation would require a fresher subject, someone who had died
Recently, naturally, without chemical interference, Finch
began volunteering at the Edinburgh Poor House. He told the administrators he wanted to offer medical care to the indigent, a charitable service. The Poor House was overcrowded, understaffed, grateful for any help from a qualified physician. No one questioned his motives. 3 times a week, Finch would visit the Poor House after his lectures. He'd examine patients, offer what comfort he could to the dying. He was kind, gentle, professional, and he waited. On November 2nd, 1853, an elderly man named Thomas Kearney died of pneumonia in the Poor House infirmary. He was 73 years old, no living family, no one to claim the body. Finch offered to handle the arrangements. For anatomical study, he explained to the poorhouse director. The college is always in need of specimens. The director was grateful. One less body to bury in the pauper's field. Finch transported Kearney's body to his private laboratory that night. The man had been dead less than 4 hours. This time, Finch didn't hesitate,
didn't debate,
didn't pretend this was about scientific curiosity. He knew what this was now. He prepared a portion of tissue from the upper arm. He cooked it simply, salt, a bit of butter from his kitchen over a clean flame. He treated it the way he'd treat any other meat, and when he tasted it, the difference from the preserved cadaver was striking, fresh, tender, the chemical bitterness gone. Just flesh, prepared and consumed. It wasn't revulsion he felt, it was satisfaction.
And something darker still, a craving. By December,
Finch had consumed portions of 3 bodies from the Poor House. By January 1854, he'd stopped pretending this was anything other than what it was, addiction. He needed it now, not wanted, needed. The thought of it consumed him during the day. At night, alone in his laboratory, he gave in to the compulsion over and over. He tried to stop. He would go days without acting on the urge, forcing himself to abstain, convinced he could regain control. But the withdrawal was agony.
Not physical, or not entirely physical.
It was psychological, a gnawing emptiness that made everything else feel hollow and meaningless. When he finally gave in again, the relief was overwhelming. He was eating from corpses twice a week now, sometimes more. He lost weight. He stopped sleeping properly. His colleagues at the medical college noticed the change. "Finch, are you ill?" Dr. Morrison asked him one afternoon. "You look exhausted." "Just working too hard," Finch replied with a thin smile. "You know how I get absorbed in my research." Morrison accepted this. Everyone knew Finch was dedicated to his work. No one knew what that work had become. By February, even fresh cadavers weren't enough, because Finch had begun to notice something. The flesh of someone who died naturally, of old age, of disease, tasted different from someone who died suddenly. The chemistry was different. The tissue was affected by the manner of death. He found himself wondering, what would it taste like from someone who died in perfect health? Someone whose body hadn't been ravaged by illness or age. The thought horrified him, but he couldn't escape it. He was in his laboratory late one February night, consuming portions of a poorhouse corpse, when he realized the truth. He was going to kill someone. Not now, not today, but eventually, because the compulsion was escalating, and the only thing that would satisfy it now was something he couldn't obtain legally. He looked down at his hands that had once healed, that had taught, that had advanced medical knowledge, and saw what they'd become, monsters' hands. And the worst part, the part that made him drop to his knees in his locked laboratory and sob like a child, was that he knew he wouldn't stop. He couldn't stop. He was too far gone. The addiction had him completely now, and it was only going to get worse. What Professor Alister Finch didn't know, couldn't have known, in that moment of terrible clarity, was that he wouldn't face this descent alone. In 6 months' time, he would decide that if he was damned anyway,
He wouldn't be damned in isolation. He would bring his students with him. Because if he couldn't stop himself,
at least he wouldn't be the only monster in the room. April 1854. 6 months after his first deliberate consumption of human flesh, Professor Alister Finch stood in the shadows of a narrow alley off Cowgate Street, watching a man who didn't know he was about to die. The man was a vagrant. 50 years old, perhaps older. The streets aged people quickly. He'd been drinking, that much was clear from the way he stumbled as he walked. No family, Finch had confirmed.
no employment, no friends who'd notice his absence, no
one who would miss him. Finch had been following him for 3 days, observing, planning, justifying. The bodies from the poorhouse had sustained him through the winter, but the quality had been poor. The elderly, the sick, the diseased, their flesh was compromised by whatever had killed them. Thin, tough, tainted by illness. Finch's addiction demanded better. He'd tried to resist. God, he'd tried. He'd gone 2 weeks without giving in to the compulsion, forcing himself to abstain, convinced that he could break the cycle through sheer willpower. The withdrawal had nearly destroyed him. He couldn't sleep, couldn't focus during lectures. His hands shook so badly he had to cancel his anatomy demonstrations. At night, he would lie awake in his bed, his entire body screaming for something he couldn't name, something he'd never needed before but now couldn't live without. On the 14th day, he'd broken. He'd gone to his laboratory and consumed the last of his poorhouse specimens, flesh that had been dead for over a week, barely palatable even when cooked, but it had brought relief.
immediate and overwhelming, and with that relief came a terrible understanding. He would never be free of this.
The addiction wasn't something he could overcome or manage. It was part of him now, as fundamental as breathing. If he couldn't stop, then the only question was how to continue, which meant he needed a reliable source. Fresh, healthy, untainted by disease or age, which meant he needed to kill. The vagrant turned down an even narrower alley, darker and more isolated. Finch followed, his surgeon's bag heavy in his hand. Inside, a bottle of chloroform and a clean cloth. Quick, humane, the man would feel nothing. Finch told himself that mercy mattered. The alley was empty.
No witnesses.
The sounds of the main street, vendors shouting, carriages rattling past, the general chaos of Edinburgh at dusk felt impossibly distant. Finch's heart was pounding. His hands were steady now, steadier than they'd been in weeks. as if his body knew what was coming and had made peace with it. The vagrant stopped to lean against a wall, breathing heavily. Finch approached. "Sir," he said gently, "are you unwell?"
"I'm a physician." The man looked up, eyes unfocused. "Just tired, so tired. Let me help you," Finch said.
He opened his bag, retrieved the cloth, dampened it with chloroform. "This will help you rest." He pressed the cloth to the vagrant's face. The man struggled, but only for a moment. His body went limp. Finch caught him, lowering him carefully to the ground. For a long moment, Finch just knelt there, the unconscious man in his arms, fully aware that he could still stop. He could walk away, leave the man to wake up hours later with nothing more than a headache and a confused memory he could still turn back from.
This, but he didn't, Finch.
Reached into his bag and retrieved a scalpel. What happened next? He would later record in his private journal with clinical precision the exact location of the incision, the depth required, the time it took for the heart to stop beating. He noted that the man never woke, never felt pain. Finch told himself that mercy mattered. He transported the body to his laboratory in a canvas sack, entering through the back entrance of the medical college long after the students and faculty had gone home. His private laboratory had a separate entrance, a locked door only he could access. No one saw him. No one ever saw him. By midnight, Finch had prepared a portion of tissue from the upper thigh. Fresh. From a body that had been healthy and alive just hours earlier. He cooked it simply. Salt, butter, heat. And when he tasted it, the difference was extraordinary, tender, clean, unmarked by disease or decay. This was what he'd been craving without knowing it. This was what the addiction had been building toward. Finch ate slowly, methodically, documenting every sensation in his journal with the detachment of a scientist recording experimental results. But his hands were shaking as he wrote, because he knew what this meant. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He wasn't just consuming the dead anymore. He was creating the dead for the purpose of consumption. He was a murderer. Now, and the worst part, the part that made him set down his pen and press his hands to his face, was that he already knew he'd do it again. The relief, the satisfaction, the quiet of the addiction finally being properly fed. It was worth it. God help him. It was worth it. By the summer of 1854, Finch had killed 4 more times. He was careful, methodical. He chose victims no one would miss. Vagrants, drifters, prostitutes, working the darkest corners of Edinburgh's old town. He varied his methods, his locations, his timing. He left no patterns for authorities to find, and no one noticed. Why would they? People disappeared from Edinburgh's slums all the time. The poor, the desperate, the forgotten, they were ghosts even while alive. When they vanished, the city barely blinked. Finch kept teaching, kept lecturing, maintained his reputation as the brilliant, if somewhat eccentric, Professor Finch. But the cost was becoming visible. He'd lost nearly 2 stone in weight. His clothes hung loose on his frame. His face had become gaunt, almost skeletal. Dark circles shadowed his eyes that had developed a feverish intensity that made students
uncomfortable when he looked at them too directly. Professor Finch, his
colleague Dr. Hammond had said to him in late July, "You need to see a physician. You're clearly unwell." "I'm fine," Finch had replied, "just absorbed in my research." "Your research is consuming you. You have no idea," Finch had thought but didn't say. The truth was that the addiction was escalating faster than he could manage. Where once he'd needed to feed the compulsion weekly, now it was every few days. The intervals between kills were shrinking, and the psychological toll was mounting. Finch had always been solitary, but now he was truly isolated. He couldn't speak to anyone about what he was experiencing.
couldn't share the burden.
Couldn't confess to another living soul the thing he'd become. The loneliness was crushing. He would stand in front of his lecture hall, 50 students watching him demonstrate a dissection, and feel completely alone, separated from humanity by a secret so dark it created an unbridgeable gulf between him and everyone else. At night, in his laboratory surrounded by evidence of his crimes, the isolation became unbearable. "I can't do this alone anymore," he thought one night in early August. Staring at his reflection in the window glass, a gaunt stranger with haunted eyes.
"I can't carry this secret by myself. It's destroying me." And that's when the new thought emerged. What if I didn't have to be alone?
He dismissed it immediately. The idea was insane. Involving someone else would only increase the risk of discovery, would require trusting another person with knowledge that could lead to his execution. But the thought persisted. What if there was someone like me?
Someone who could understand. Someone who could share this burden?
And then more seductively, what if I could create someone like me? Finch's students trusted him,
Admired him.
Some of them would do anything to gain his approval, to be part of his inner circle of favored pupils. What if he chose carefully, found a student who was brilliant but isolated, intellectually curious but morally flexible? Someone who might understand, given the right approach, the right arguments, the right progression of ideas. He could bring them in slowly, test their boundaries, see how far they'd follow him down the path of forbidden knowledge. And if he succeeded,
he wouldn't be alone anymore. The addiction would have company. Finch spent the next month observing his students with new eyes,
evaluating them not for their anatomical knowledge or surgical skill, but for their potential to become what he was. He needed someone intelligent enough to understand the intellectual framework he'd constructed to justify his actions, someone isolated enough to crave belonging, someone hungry for approval, for validation, for the feeling of being special, someone he could corrupt. In September 1854, Finch found his first candidate. His name was Edmund Voss. 22 years old, third-year medical student, brilliant but troubled. Edmund's father had been a physician who died of cholera when Edmund was 16. His mother had remarried quickly, a wealthy merchant who'd sent Edmund to medical school but made it clear he considered it a waste of money. Edmund was alone, desperate to prove himself, hungry for a father figure, though he'd never admit it, and he was utterly devoted to Professor Finch. "Your dissection technique is exceptional," Finch told him one evening in late September, after the other students had left the anatomy theatre. "You have instincts most students take years to develop." Edmund's face flushed with pride.
"Thank you, Professor."
"That means everything coming from you." "I've been considering taking on a research assistant," Finch continued, watching Edmund's reaction carefully. "Someone for my private projects. The work would be unconventional. It would require absolute discretion."
"And an open mind. I have an open mind, sir," Edmund said quickly.
"Too quickly. Desperate to be chosen, do you?"
Finch asked. "Tell me, Edmund, how open?"
"If I shared research that challenged conventional morality, could you evaluate it objectively, without letting societal prejudice cloud your scientific judgment?" Edmund hesitated, but only for a moment. "Science should pursue truth wherever it leads, sir, regardless of moral fashion." Perfect answer. "Then perhaps we should discuss this further," Finch said. "Come to my private laboratory tomorrow evening, 9 o'clock. We'll talk about the nature of taboo and why certain knowledge remains forbidden." Edmund agreed immediately. The next evening, Finch began Edmund's education, not with cannibalism. Not yet. That would come later, after the foundation was laid. He started with philosophy, with questions designed to erode moral certainty. Edmund society tells us certain acts are absolutely wrong. But why? Who decides? And are those decisions based on truth or merely on comfort? He introduced Edmund to transgressive texts, to say, controversial medical papers about human experimentation, historical accounts of practices considered barbaric by modern standards, but once accepted as normal. The Aztecs practiced ritual human sacrifice, Finch said during one of their evening sessions. They believed it sustained the universe. To them it was sacred.
To us, it's monstrous.
But who's to say our moral framework is correct and theirs was wrong? Morality is cultural. Truth is objective. Edmund absorbed it all, hungry for knowledge, for belonging, for the privilege of being Professor Finch's chosen student. Over the next month, Finch slowly, carefully introduced the idea of anthropophagy. The survivors of the Donner Party, Finch said one evening, were condemned by society for eating their dead, but they survived. The ones who refused died clinging to their morals. Which choice was wiser? Survival is a powerful justification, Edmund said carefully. But what if it wasn't just survival?
Finch asked.
What if there was scientific value in understanding human flesh as a food source? What if studying it could advance medical knowledge in ways we can't predict? He watched Edmund process this, saw the moment of internal conflict, the weighing of revulsion against curiosity. Curiosity won, I suppose,
if it was already dead.
If it served science, Finch had him. In late October, Finch showed Edmund his journals, the clinical documentation of his experiments, the careful notes on tissue composition, taste, nutritional content. He didn't tell Edmund about the murders. Not yet. He presented it as research conducted on cadavers, on bodies already dead, donated to science. "This is extraordinary," Edmund whispered, reading Finch's notes. "No one's ever approached this scientifically before." "Because everyone's too afraid of the taboo," Finch said. "But you're not afraid, are you, Edmund? You understand that knowledge has no moral quality. Only the use we make of it matters." "I understand, sir." "Then perhaps," Finch said carefully, "you'd like to contribute to the research, to observe firsthand what I've documented here." Edmund looked up from the journals, eyes bright with something between fear and excitement. "You mean, Finch said, "that I'm offering you the opportunity to cross a boundary no other student will ever cross, to know something forbidden, to understand human nature at its most fundamental level." He retrieved a small prepared portion from his cold storage, flesh from his most recent kill, preserved carefully. "This is from a cadaver acquired last week," Finch lied smoothly, fresh enough for valid observation. "I'm going to prepare it, and you're going to taste it. Just a small amount."
"Enough to understand what I've been documenting." Edmund stared at the tissue.
Finch could see the war happening behind his eyes. Revulsion versus curiosity. Morality versus ambition. The desire to flee versus the desperate need to be special, to be chosen, to be part of something extraordinary. Will it change me?"
Edmund asked quietly. "Yes," Finch thought. "Irrevocably. It will educate you," he said aloud.
"You'll know something no one else knows. You'll be part of groundbreaking research, and you'll never look at human anatomy the same way again." Edmund took a shaky breath. "I'll do it." Finch prepared the tissue as Edmund watched, hands trembling. He cooked it simply, the way he'd done so many times before. The smell filled the laboratory. Meat cooking, familiar and wrong at once. When it was ready, Finch placed a small piece on a clean dish and handed it to Edmund. "Take your time," he said gently.
"There's no rush.
"But know that once you do this, you'll be different from everyone else. You'll carry knowledge they can't imagine.
You'll be truly exceptional." Edmund picked up the piece of cooked human flesh. He closed his eyes and he ate it. Finch watched his face, the initial revulsion,
The confusion as his body registered it as simply protein. The dawning realization that it wasn't the apocalyptic evil he'd expected, it was just meat. "How do you feel?" Finch asked. Edmund opened his eyes. They were wide, shocked, but not with horror, with wonder.
I don't know how I feel.
It wasn't.
I thought it would be worse. I thought I'd be sick. But I'm not. Is that wrong?"
That I'm not horrified? Nothing about this is wrong, Finch said softly. You've simply learned a truth others are too afraid to face. You're a scientist now, Edmund.
A true scientist.
One who pursues knowledge regardless of where it leads. Edmund looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. What have I become? He whispered. Something better, Finch said. Something free from the chains of conventional morality. Something evolved, and there it was. The moment Finch had been waiting for, Edmund Voss wasn't horrified. He was exhilarated. He'd found it thrilling. The transgression, the secret knowledge, the sense of being part of an elite few who dared to cross forbidden boundaries. Finch recognized it because he'd felt it himself. Edmund was like him, and now Finch wasn't alone anymore. Once Edmund had crossed the line, bringing him further became easy. Within 2 weeks, Finch had revealed the truth, that his research required fresh specimens, that he'd been acquiring them himself, that the bodies weren't donated. They were hunted. Edmund should have been horrified, should have fled to the authorities. Instead, he asked, "How do you choose them?" Because by then, Edmund had tasted human flesh 3 more times, and each time the taboo had weakened. Each time the act had become more normal, more acceptable, more necessary. The addiction had him too now. I choose carefully, Finch explained. People society has already discarded. The homeless, the forgotten. Their deaths change nothing except the advancement of our knowledge. Edmund nodded slowly.
That's rational. Would you like to help me acquire the next specimen?
Finch asked. Edmund hesitated for only a moment. Yes. In November 1854, Edmund Voss helped Professor Finch hunt and kill a vagrant in the Grassmarket district. He held the chloroform cloth while Finch made the incision. Afterward, in Finch's laboratory, they prepared and consumed portions of the body together. 2 monsters, feeding together. And Finch felt something he hadn't felt in months. Relief. The crushing isolation lifted.
He had a companion now.
Someone who understood. Someone who shared the burden and the secret. But Edmund wasn't enough, because Finch had discovered something new. Corrupting Edmund had been almost as satisfying as the feeding itself. The process of taking a bright, moral young man and transforming him into something dark and forbidden. There was a power in that, a twisted creative act. I made him what he is, Finch thought.
I'm not just a monster.
I'm a creator of monsters, and if he could do it once, he could do it again. In December, Finch approached a second student, James Hartley, 23 years old, orphaned at 12, raised in workhouses, fought his way to medical school through sheer determination, brilliant but angry, resentful of the wealthy students who'd had everything handed to them. Finch used a different approach with James. Not intellectual seduction, but validation of his anger. Society is a lie, James. It pretends to value merit, but it only rewards birth and wealth. Men like you and me, we have to take what we deserve because it will never be given. James was receptive, hungry for someone to tell him his anger was justified. When Finch finally revealed the truth, showed him the forbidden research,
offered him the chance to transgress as the ultimate act of rebellion against a society that had discarded him, James barely hesitated. They threw me away, James said.
Staring at the prepared flesh Finch offered. Called me worthless. Treated me like I was less than human. Why should I respect their rules about what's forbidden? He consumed it almost defiantly, and then there were 3. The third student was recruited in January 1855, Peter Caldwell, 21 years old, quiet, withdrawn. He'd come from a deeply religious family that had disowned him when he'd chosen medical school over seminary. He was lost, disconnected from his faith, but with nothing to replace it. Finch offered him a new religion. Science is the only true path to understanding, Finch told him. Your family's God demanded faith without evidence. I'm offering you truth through direct experience. Knowledge your God would keep forbidden because he knows it would free you from his control. For Peter, consuming human flesh became an act of spiritual liberation. a deliberate rejection of the religion that had rejected him. He wept the first time, but he did it, and then there were four. By February 1855, Finch had his circle. 4 students who'd crossed the boundary, 4 young men who were now bound to him and to each other by shared guilt and shared hunger. They met twice a week in Finch's laboratory. They hunted together now, working as a team to acquire subjects. They developed a system, one to distract, one to administer the chloroform, one to transport the body, and afterward, they would gather around Finch's dissection table and consume their kill together. Finch called it the seminar. He'd even begun to formalize the teachings, to create a philosophy around their practices. "We are beyond the constraints of conventional morality," he told them during one session. "We have looked into the abyss of human nature and found truth there. We understand what other men are too afraid to see. That civilization is a thin veneer.
That beneath it we are all animals.
And the strong animals feed on the weak.
That's not evil.
That's nature. The students absorbed it, needed it, because they needed some framework, some justification to make sense of what they'd become. Edmund, James, and Peter were fully initiated now, fully corrupted. But Finch wanted more. In March 1855, he began the seduction of his final 3 students: Richard Webb, Martin Cross, Daniel Thorne. The process was faster now. Finch had refined his technique. He knew exactly what to say, which psychological vulnerabilities to exploit, how to make the forbidden seem not just acceptable, but exhilarating. By mid-March, all 7 students had been brought into the circle. 7 young men who'd arrived at Edinburgh Medical College with dreams of healing. 7 young men who now hunted and consumed human flesh under the guidance of their professor, Finch. Looked at them during their March 14th meeting. 7 faces illuminated by lamplight, all watching him with a mixture of dependence and hunger, and felt a surge of dark pride. I did this.
I created this. I'm not just a monster.
I'm the master of monsters. Gentlemen, he said, I think it's time we celebrate how far we've come. Tomorrow night, I'm hosting a special dinner.
A formal affair.
We'll prepare a meal properly. Multiple courses, good wine, all the civilized trappings of society. He smiled. And we'll use the freshest possible ingredients. The students understood. Several of them smiled back. They would acquire a subject that very night. They would prepare an elaborate meal. They would sit together like gentlemen and they would feast. What Finch didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that one of his students, the youngest, Daniel Thorne, was already fracturing under the weight of what he'd become, and that after tomorrow's dinner, Daniel would run straight to the constabulary, straight to the end. March 14th, 1855. 7 o'clock in the evening, Professor Alister Finch's private laboratory had been transformed. The dissection table had been covered with a white linen cloth. 7 chairs arranged around it. Fine china, Finch's personal set, brought from his townhouse, placed at each setting. Crystal wine glasses, silver cutlery that gleamed in the lamplight. It looked like a gentleman's dinner party, except for what was being prepared in the corner. Edmund Voss stood at the preparation station, working with the focused precision Finch had taught him. He'd removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, tied on an apron. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, cutting, trimming, arranging portions on serving platters. The body they'd acquired the night before lay on a secondary table, partially obscured by a sheet.
A vagrant they'd found near Holyrood Palace.
Male, approximately 40 years old, relatively healthy before his death by chloroform and subsequent exsanguination, fresh, perfect for their purposes. How's the preparation coming? Finch asked, inspecting Edmund's work. Nearly ready, Professor. I've prepared portions from the loin, the shoulder, and the thigh. Different textures, as you suggested. For variety, excellent. And you've seasoned them? Rosemary, thyme, salt, pepper. I thought we should prepare this as we would any proper meal. No more pretending it's something other than what it is, Finch smiled. Exactly right, Edmund. We're past shame now.
Past guilt.
Tonight is a celebration of how far we've come. The other students began arriving at 7:30. James Hartley arrived first, carrying 2 bottles of wine he'd stolen from his wealthy roommate. If we're doing this properly, we need proper wine. Peter Caldwell came next, nervous but determined. He'd been fasting since morning. I want to fully appreciate the meal, he'd explained. Richard Webb, Martin Cross, and Daniel Thorne arrived together. Daniel looked ill. He was the youngest of the group, just 19 years old, and he'd been the last to be fully initiated into Finch's circle. For the past 2 weeks, since he'd first consumed human flesh, Daniel had been withdrawing, growing quieter. His hands shook constantly now. "Daniel," Finch said, gripping the young man's shoulder. "Are you well?" "I'm fine, Professor," Daniel said, but his voice was hollow. "This dinner is important," Finch said quietly, so only Daniel could hear. "It's our ritual, our bond. After tonight, you'll feel better. You'll understand your place in all this." Daniel nodded but didn't meet Finch's eyes. Finch should have paid more attention to that, should have recognized the signs of psychological fracture. But he was too focused on the evening ahead, on his creation, on the 7 young men he'd corrupted, gathered together in celebration of their shared darkness. At 8 o'clock, they sat, Finch at the head of the table, 3 students on each side. The laboratory's gas lamps turned low, creating an intimate atmosphere. Candles on the table flickering. It looked civilized, refined. James poured the wine. Finch raised his glass. "Gentlemen," he said, 18 months ago I crossed a boundary I never imagined crossing. I tasted forbidden knowledge, and it changed me forever. 6 months ago I decided I wouldn't walk this path alone. And each of you chose to follow me into darkness, chose to pursue truth even when it violated every rule society holds sacred. The students watched him, rapt. Tonight, we celebrate that choice. We acknowledge what we are without shame or hesitation. We are beyond conventional morality. We are scientists who pursue knowledge wherever it leads. We are men who have looked into the abyss and found enlightenment there." He raised his glass higher. "To forbidden knowledge, to scientific truth, to us." "To us," the students echoed, raising their glasses, all except Daniel, whose hand trembled so badly he nearly dropped his glass. They drank. And then Edmund brought out the first course. He'd arranged the portions artfully on the serving platter. Finch had taught him well. Presentation mattered. This wasn't butchery. This was culinary craft applied to the ultimate taboo. Edmund served each student a portion. The meat was cooked medium rare, seared on the outside, pink within, garnished with herbs.
It could have been beef or venison or any other meat, but it wasn't. From the shoulder, Edmund explained as he served.
Lean, well-muscled. Should be quite tender, Finch cut into his portion. The knife slid through easily. He placed the piece in his mouth and chewed, slowly savoring it. Excellent preparation, Edmund. Perfectly cooked. The students began eating. Some tentatively, still wrestling with residual guilt. Others with growing confidence. James ate with almost aggressive enthusiasm, as if each bite was an act of defiance against the society that had rejected him. Peter ate with his eyes closed, murmuring something that might have been a prayer or a curse, hard to tell which. Richard and Martin ate steadily, their faces carefully neutral, neither showing disgust nor enjoyment. Edmund ate with quiet satisfaction, proud of his culinary work, and Daniel sat frozen, staring at the meat on his plate, tears streaming silently down his face. "Daniel!" Finch said sharply.
"Eat." "I can't," Daniel whispered. "You can."
"You have before. I can't do this anymore." Daniel's voice broke.
"Professor, please." "I can't." The table went silent.
The other students stared at Daniel with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Daniel," Finch said, his voice gentler now, "I understand this is difficult, but you're past the point of return. You've already crossed the line. Refusing now doesn't undo what you've done. It only makes you a hypocrite." "I don't care," Daniel said.
"I don't care anymore."
"This is wrong. We're wrong."
"All of this is—" "Eat!" Finch commanded. "No," Finch's expression hardened.
"You will eat, Daniel.
"Or you will leave this circle."
And if you leave, I cannot guarantee your safety. We all know too much about each other. We're bound by shared guilt. If one of us breaks that bond..." The threat hung in the air. Daniel looked around the table at the other students, looking for support, for someone else who felt the horror he felt, but he saw only cold faces. They were too far gone, too committed, and they knew what Daniel's rejection of the meal implied, that what they were doing was monstrous.
That they were monsters. They couldn't accept that.
Couldn't face that truth, so they stared at him with hard eyes and waited for him to comply. Daniel picked up his fork with a shaking hand. He cut a small piece of meat. He closed his eyes. And he ate, Finch smiled. "Good. Now let's continue." The dinner proceeded, course after course. Different preparations of human flesh, each one presented and consumed with the ritual formality Finch had created. They talked as they ate, discussed the textures, the flavors, compared this specimen to previous ones. Edmund explained his preparation techniques. James proposed hunting strategies for future acquisitions. It was grotesque in its normalcy. A dinner party where the cuisine was human flesh and the conversation was about murder and consumption. By the fourth course, even Daniel was eating mechanically, his mind clearly somewhere else, dissociated from what his body was doing. At 9:30, Finch stood and raised his glass one final time. "Gentlemen, you are my greatest achievement, not my published papers, not my anatomical discoveries. I have created something unprecedented, a circle of enlightened men who have transcended the moral limitations that constrain lesser minds.
I am proud of each of you." The students, except Daniel, smiled with dark pride. "Now," Finch continued, "we should clean and prepare for departure.
We'll dispose of the remains in the usual manner.
Edmund, James, you'll handle the laboratory.
Peter, Richard, Martin, take care of the table settings.
Daniel, you'll assist me with..." But Daniel was already standing, stumbling backward from the table. "I have to go," he said, his voice strangled. "I have to. I need air. Daniel, sit down," Finch said. "I can't breathe." "I can't." Daniel turned and ran. He crashed through the laboratory door and disappeared into the dark corridor beyond. For a moment,
the remaining 6 men sat in stunned silence. Then James said what they were all thinking. He's going to talk. Finch's mind raced. Daniel knew everything. Names, dates, methods.
"If he went to the authorities, we need to find him," Edmund said. "Stop him before..." "No," Finch said quietly. "It's too late."
"If we chase him, we look guilty. If he reports us, they'll need evidence."
"And we're about to destroy all of it. What do we do?"
Peter asked, his face pale. Finch looked around at his remaining students, his creations, his companions in darkness. "We finish what we started," he said. "We clean this laboratory until there's no trace of what happened here. We dispose of the remains completely.
And then we wait.
If Daniel reports us, it's his word against ours."
A hysterical student making wild accusations against a respected professor and 6 upstanding medical students. It was a thin hope, and Finch knew it. But it was all they had.
Daniel Thorne ran through the dark streets of Edinburgh, sobbing and gasping for air. His mind was fragmenting. The dinner kept replaying in his mind, the taste, the smell, the casual conversation while they consumed human flesh. The professor's proud smile, the other students' acceptance of it all. What have I become? What have we become? He'd told himself it was science. that Professor Finch was a genius leading them to forbidden knowledge, that they were special, enlightened, beyond conventional morality. But tonight, sitting at that table, eating that meal, he'd seen the truth. They weren't enlightened. They were monsters, and he was a monster too. Daniel collapsed against a wall in a narrow close off the Royal Mile,
vomiting until there was nothing left in his stomach.
but he could still taste it, could still feel the texture of human flesh in his mouth. God forgive me. God forgive me. God forgive me. He didn't know how long he knelt there. Minutes, hours. Time had lost meaning, but eventually a clarity cut through the horror. He had to stop this, had to stop Finch, had to save the other students before they were completely lost. Even if it meant condemning himself, Daniel stood on shaking
Legs and stumbled toward the constabulary.
Station on High Street, Constable William Macready didn't believe the hysterical young man who burst into the station at 10
o'clock that night. You're telling me,
Macready said slowly,
that Professor Alister Finch, the anatomist, is killing people and eating them?
and that he's forced you and 6 other students to participate?
Not forced, Daniel said, tears streaming down his face. He convinced us.
Made us believe it was science.
Made us think we were special. But it's murder.
It's cannibalism.
You have to stop him. You have to stop us. Son, that's a serious accusation. Professor Finch is a respected... I know what he is,
Daniel shouted.
I know what everyone thinks he is. But I'm telling you the truth.
Right now, tonight, they're in his laboratory cleaning up from a dinner where we ate. He couldn't finish. He doubled over, dry heaving. Sergeant Duncan Reed, who'd been listening from his desk, stood and approached. What if the boy's telling the truth? Reed said quietly to Macready. What if there's even a chance? Then we're talking about a professor at the medical college. We'd need evidence, cause, proper authority, or, Reed said, we could just go have a look.
Late night check.
If the boy's mad or lying, we apologize to the professor and send the student home. But if there's any chance... Macready looked at Daniel's anguished face, at the genuine terror in his eyes. Get Farrow, he said. The 3 of us will go, quietly. If this is nothing, I don't want it getting around that we're harassing college professors based on student hysteria. At 2:40 in the morning, on March 15th, 3 constables approached the medical college. Daniel had given them detailed directions to Finch's private laboratory, the back entrance. The locked corridor, he'll be there, Daniel had said. He stays late. He's always there. They found the door locked. Macready knocked. Professor Finch? Edinburgh Constabulary. We need a word, sir. No response. Professor, we can get a warrant if needed, but it would be easier if you just opened the door. Still nothing. Break it down, Reed said. Macready nodded to Farrow, who was the largest of the 3. Farrow slammed his shoulder into the door. Once. Twice. On the 3rd impact, the lock gave way. The door swung open, and the smell hit them. Meat cooking.
Chemical cleaning agents trying to mask it.
And underneath, something rotten and sweet that made Macready's stomach turn. They entered with lanterns raised. The laboratory was a large stone room with high ceilings. Shelves lined the walls, filled with specimen jars and anatomical models. A large dissection table dominated the center, and hunched over a secondary table in the corner was Professor Alister Finch. His back was to them. He was doing something to a body on the table, working with focused intensity, not having heard them break in over the sound of his own activity. Professor Finch? Reed called out. Finch froze, then slowly, very slowly, he turned. His face was smeared with blood, his hands covered to the wrists. His eyes, when they caught the lantern light, were wild and feverish and somehow relieved. Thank God you've come, Finch whispered. Macready raised his lantern higher. The light fell on the table behind Finch, a human body. Fresh, partially consumed, flesh torn from one arm, portions of the torso removed. And on a plate beside the body, Farrow turned and vomited Professor Alister Finch, Reed said, his voice shaking. You are under arrest for... You shouldn't have come alone, Finch said, his tone shifting. That's when they heard movement. 3 figures emerged from the shadows at the back of the laboratory. Young men, students, gaunt, hollow-eyed, their
mouths stained dark, and they were moving toward the constables. They won't let you take me, Finch said. They need me. Edmund Voss stepped into the lamplight.
Professor is right. You can't arrest him. We won't allow it. Macready's hand went to his truncheon. Son, step back. All of you.
This doesn't have to. You don't understand, James Hartley said, his voice desperate. If he's arrested, we're all condemned. All of us.
We're bound together? Then you're all under arrest, Reed said firmly. Every one of you.
Put your hands where we can see them. For a long moment, no one moved. The 3 constables, truncheons drawn.
Finch and his 3 remaining students caught between fight and flight. Then Peter Caldwell began to cry. I'm sorry, he sobbed.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't want this. I didn't want to be this. And the spell broke. The students didn't fight.
They simply collapsed. Mentally. Physically. The weight of what they'd done, the horror of being caught, the impossible reality crashing down on them all at once. James sank to his knees. Edmund pressed his back against the wall, sliding down to sit on the floor, hands over his face. Peter fell to the ground, curling into himself, sobbing. Only Finch remained standing. You're too late, he said quietly. The damage is done. I've created them, changed them. They'll never be normal again.
Even if you hang me, even if you lock them away, they'll always carry this.
They'll always know the taste. They'll always be what I made them, he smiled then. A terrible, broken smile. I've corrupted them completely.
And you can't undo that. No one can. By dawn, the medical college was swarming with police. Sergeant Reed had sent for reinforcements immediately after the arrests.
By 4 a.m., the college's director had been roused from bed. By 5 a.m., Edinburgh's chief constable was on site. By 6 a.m., the full scope of what Finch had done was beginning to emerge. In Finch's laboratory, investigators found the fresh body on the table, identified by day's end as Thomas Crawford, a vagrant reported missing 3 days earlier. A cold storage area containing portions of human remains from at least 3 other bodies. Journals. Meticulous, detailed journals documenting 18 months of cannibalism, dates, victims, preparations, observations. The dinner table, still set with plates containing remnants of the meal. Cooking, implements, knives, seasoning, recipes, written in Finch's precise handwriting, and a leather-bound ledger listing 7 names: his students, Edmund Voss, James Hartley, Peter Caldwell, Richard Webb, Martin Cross, Daniel Thorne, and detailed notes on how he'd corrupted each one, what psychological vulnerabilities he'd exploited,
what arguments he'd used, how long each had taken to break. It was a manual for creating monsters. My God, Chief Constable Morrison whispered, reading Finch's notes.
He didn't just commit these crimes. He studied how to make others commit them with him. Reed nodded grimly. The students we arrested, Voss, Hartley, and Caldwell, they're in cells now.
Barely responsive. I don't think they fully understand that this is real yet. And the others?
Webb, Cross, Thorne? Thorne is the one who reported it.
He's being held as a witness but may face charges.
Webb and Cross weren't at the laboratory when we raided. Find them. It took 2 more hours, but they found them. Richard Webb was in his dormitory room, packing a bag with shaking hands, planning to flee. He surrendered without resistance when constables arrived. Martin Cross was found in the college chapel. He'd taken his own life during the night. A note beside his body read, simply, I cannot live with what I've become. May God have mercy, because I do not deserve it. By noon, Edinburgh was in chaos. Word had spread. A respected professor. Medical students, cannibalism, murder. The newspapers printed special editions. Crowds gathered outside the constabulary, demanding answers. The medical college suspended all classes and announced a full investigation. And in his cell, Professor Alister Finch sat calmly asking for pen and paper. "I want to document this properly," he told his guards. "For posterity, so people understand what I discovered about human nature." They refused. But Finch didn't seem bothered. He simply sat in his cell and smiled to himself. Because even in custody, even facing execution, he knew he'd succeeded. He'd proven his theory. He'd shown that morality was fragile, that ordinary young men could be transformed into cannibalistic killers through nothing more than careful manipulation and intellectual seduction. He'd corrupted 7 souls, and even if they hanged him tomorrow, that fact would remain. He'd changed those young men forever, and in a dark, twisted way that gave him satisfaction right up until the end. The trial of Professor Alister Finch and his students began on May 2nd, 1855, at the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh. It was the most sensational criminal case Scotland had seen in decades. The courtroom was packed every single day. Journalists from London, Paris, even New York attended. Edinburgh's elite crowded the gallery. Doctors, professors, lawyers, anyone with connections enough to secure a seat. They came to see the monster, to understand how a respected man of science had become something unspeakable. Finch entered the courtroom in chains, flanked by guards. He'd lost even more weight during his 2 months in custody. His face was skeletal now, his eyes sunken but still burning with that feverish intensity. He didn't look remorseful. He looked fascinated by the spectacle. Beside him sat 5 of his students, also in chains: Edmund Voss, James Hartley, Peter Caldwell, Richard Webb, and Daniel Thorne. Martin Cross's empty chair stood as a silent accusation. The charges were read: murder, conspiracy to murder, desecration of human remains, and a charge so unusual the prosecutor had to reference medieval law to justify it: anthropophagy, cannibalism. "How do you plead?" the judge asked Finch. Finch stood slowly. "I plead," he said clearly, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom, "that I am guilty of pursuing truth. If that is a crime, then yes."
"I am guilty," the gallery erupted.
The judge's gavel cracked like gunfire. "Mr. Finch, you will answer the question as asked. Guilty or not guilty?" "Guilty," Finch said, "but unrepentant." The prosecution's case was devastating. They presented Finch's journals, page after page of meticulous documentation.
Victims identified,
Methods described. The gradual corruption of his students mapped out like a scientific
experiment, because that's what it had been to
Finch. An experiment in moral corruption. They called Daniel Thorne to testify. Daniel had spent the past 2 months in protective custody, separated from the other students. He'd been granted partial immunity in exchange for his testimony, a decision that had sparked public outrage. Many believed he should hang alongside the others. Daniel took the stand looking like a ghost, hollow-eyed, trembling, 20 years old but aged decades by guilt. "Mr. Thorne," the prosecutor said gently, "please tell the court how Professor Finch first approached you." Daniel's voice was barely audible. "He told me I was special, that I had potential the other students lacked. He made me feel seen, important." "And when did the subject of cannibalism first arise?" "Gradually. First it was just philosophy, questions about morality, whether society's rules were absolute or arbitrary. Then it was reading assignments, historical accounts of survival cannibalism, the Donner Party, shipwrecks. He made it seem academic. When did you first consume human flesh?" Daniel closed his eyes. Tears streamed down his face. "January 17th, 1855, he told me it was from a cadaver, that it was no different from any other anatomical study, that by refusing, I'd be admitting I valued social convention over scientific truth. I
wanted him to be proud of me.
I wanted to be part of his inner circle, so I did it. And how did you feel afterward?
Sick, horrified, but also... Daniel's voice broke.
Also special. Like I'd crossed a threshold the other students hadn't, like I knew something they didn't. And Professor Finch praised me, told me I was exceptional.
And I wanted more of that feeling. Did you know the victims were being murdered specifically for consumption?
Not at first. He told us they were already dead. Bodies from the poorhouse. Then in February he told us the truth, that he'd been acquiring them himself.
And by then, Daniel sobbed openly now.
By then I was already too deep.
I'd already done it, already tasted it.
And the thought of reporting him meant condemning myself too. So I stayed silent. And I kept participating.
Until the dinner, until I couldn't anymore. No further questions, the prosecutor said quietly. Finch's defense attorney, appointed by the court,
as no lawyer would voluntarily take the case, attempted to argue temporary insanity, that Finch had suffered a mental breakdown, a psychotic episode, and could not be held fully responsible. Finch rejected this defense publicly. I was not insane, he declared when given the opportunity to speak. I was never more rational, more clear-minded than during those 18 months. I formed hypotheses.
I tested them.
I documented my findings.
This was science, not madness. Science?
The prosecutor shot back. You murdered at least 7 people. 8, Finch corrected calmly. You haven't found all the bodies yet. There's one buried in the Lath Cemetery grounds. Section C, near the eastern wall. The courtroom erupted again. The prosecutor stared at Finch in horror. You're confessing to an additional murder. I'm correcting your incomplete record.
If you're going to condemn me, at least condemn me accurately. The judge's voice was ice.
Mr. Finch, do you feel any remorse whatsoever for what you've done? Finch considered this seriously. Remorse?
No, regret that I was caught, certainly.
Regret that my research was interrupted before I could complete it, yes. But remorse for the acts themselves?
No, Your Honor, I don't. Because I learned what I set out to learn. And what was that?
Finch smiled. It was a terrible smile, empty of warmth, filled with dark satisfaction. That humans are not the civilized creatures we pretend to be. That morality is a fiction we maintain only when it's convenient. That any man can be turned into a monster with the right pressure applied to the right vulnerabilities. I proved it.
7 times.
7 ordinary young men became killers and cannibals under my guidance. Not because they were evil, but because I showed them how. He looked directly at the gallery, at the horrified faces of Edinburgh's elite. And every single one of you would have done the same, given the right circumstances. You just can't admit it. The silence that followed was absolute. Then the prosecutor said quietly, "The prosecution rests, Your Honor. This man has condemned himself more thoroughly than I ever could." The jury deliberated for 40 minutes. They found Finch guilty on all counts. They found Edmund Voss, James Hartley, and Peter Caldwell guilty of conspiracy to murder and desecration of remains. Richard Webb, who'd been absent from the final dinner and had attempted to flee, was found guilty of lesser charges. Daniel Thorne, due to his cooperation and testimony, was convicted only of desecration of remains. When the judge asked if Finch had anything to say before sentencing, Finch stood one last time. "I regret nothing," he said clearly. "I expanded human knowledge. I revealed truths about our nature that society desperately wants to ignore. And long after I'm dead, my research will remain. People will study what I did, try to understand it, try to prevent it from happening again. But they'll fail. Because what I discovered is fundamental. Human beings are capable of anything. Morality is learned, not innate. And with the right teacher, anyone can be taught to abandon it." He looked at his students, sitting in their chains, hollow-eyed and broken. "I created them.
"And I regret nothing." The judge's voice shook with barely controlled rage as he pronounced sentence. "Alister Finch, you are hereby sentenced to death by hanging."
Sentence to be carried out 1 month hence. Edmund Voss, James Hartley, Peter Caldwell, 20 years penal servitude. Richard Webb, 10 years penal servitude. Daniel Thorne, 5 years penal servitude. As the guards led them from the courtroom, Peter Caldwell screamed, a raw, agonized sound that echoed off the stone walls. Edmund simply stared straight ahead, his face blank. James was weeping silently. Richard looked relieved it wasn't worse, and Daniel collapsed, having to be carried from the courtroom. But Finch walked calmly, head high, that slight smile still on his lips. He'd accomplished what he set out to do, and not even death could undo that. June 3rd, 1855. The gallows were erected in the Lawn Market outside the High Court. A crowd of nearly 20,000 gathered to watch Professor Alister Finch hang. Some came for justice, some for spectacle, some simply because they needed to see the monster die to believe this nightmare was truly over. Finch was led from his cell at dawn. He'd refused the traditional final meal. "I've developed specific tastes," he'd told his jailers with dark humor. "Nothing you'd offer would satisfy me now." He'd refused the chaplain as well. "I require no forgiveness from a God I don't believe in." But he'd asked for one thing: permission to make a final statement from the scaffold. The request was denied. The authorities feared what he might say, feared he might use his last moments to further corrupt, to plant seeds of his twisted philosophy in the minds of those watching. But Finch made his statement anyway. As they placed the noose around his neck, as the crowd below shouted and jeered, Finch looked out over the sea of faces and spoke loudly enough to be heard. "You think you're different from me.
You think you could never do what I did. But you're wrong. Every single one of you is capable of the same darkness. You just haven't been pushed far enough yet. You just haven't had the right teacher."
The executioner pulled the lever. The trap door opened. Professor Alister Finch dropped. His neck broke instantly. Death was quick. But his words lingered in the air long after his body stopped twitching. The crowd was silent as they dispersed. Many would later report feeling unsettled by his final statement, disturbed by the possibility that he might be, that the line between civilized human and
monster was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The students' fates.
46-49. The 5 surviving students served their sentences in different prisons across Scotland, deliberately separated to prevent them from reinforcing each other's darkness. Their fates varied dramatically. Edmund Voss was sent to Perth Prison. He was a model prisoner, quiet, obedient, withdrawn. He spent his days in the prison library reading medical texts, trying to reclaim some sense of the man he'd been before Finch. He was released after 17 years for good behavior. Upon release, Edmund disappeared. Some reports placed him in America, living under an assumed name. Others claimed he'd gone to Australia. A few persistent rumors suggested he'd taken his own life within days of release. The truth was never confirmed. Edmund Voss simply vanished from history, taking his guilt with him. James Hartley didn't survive his sentence. In his 3rd year of imprisonment at Aberdeen Prison, James was involved in a violent altercation with another inmate. The details were unclear, but the result wasn't. James was found dead in his cell, beaten severely. The official report listed it as an accident during a fight, but guards later admitted that once word spread about what James had done, about what he'd eaten, the other prisoners had made his life unbearable. He'd been targeted, tormented, brutalized. The system had failed to protect him, or perhaps it had simply chosen not to. Peter Caldwell suffered a complete mental breakdown in his 2nd
year at Peterhead Prison. He'd
Been fragile from the start, the student who'd
wept during the trial.
who'd screamed when sentenced. Prison destroyed what little stability he had left. He began experiencing hallucinations, claimed he could still taste human flesh, that it was stuck in his mouth no matter how much he tried to wash it away, claimed the victims came to him at night, showing him what he'd done to them. He was eventually transferred to a criminal lunatic asylum. He spent the remaining 15 years of his life there, never speaking, never responding to treatment, locked inside his own private hell. He died in 1872, age 39, still haunted by what he'd become under Finch's guidance. Richard Webb served his full 10 years at Edinburgh's Calton jail. Unlike the others, Richard emerged seemingly intact. He'd been the least involved, absent from the final dinner, attempting to flee when he learned of the arrests. His guilt was real, but less consuming than the others. Upon release in 1865, Richard emigrated to Canada. He changed his name, started a new life, became a clerk in a shipping company. He married,
had children.
never told his family about his past. In 1889, a journalist researching the Finch case tracked Richard down. The journalist later reported, "I found a quiet man in his 50s, living an ordinary life. When I mentioned Edinburgh, his face went pale. When I mentioned Finch, he asked me to leave. As I was going, he said something I'll never forget. I think about it every single day.
Every meal I eat, I remember.
And I wonder if I'm really as free as I pretend to be." Richard Webb died in 1903. Taking his memories to the grave, Daniel Thorne served 5 years and was released in 1860. He was 25 years old. His youth stolen by guilt and horror. Daniel attempted to rebuild his life. He tried to return to medicine, but found he couldn't bear the sight of anatomy anymore, couldn't handle dissection, couldn't separate the science from the memory of what he'd done. He became a clerk instead.
Quiet work?
Simple work. Work that kept him away from anything that reminded him of Finch. But the guilt never left. In 1867, Daniel wrote a confession, a detailed account of everything that had happened, everything Finch had done, everything the students had become. He published it anonymously as a pamphlet, Confessions of a Cannibal, a warning to the young. It sold thousands of copies. People were horrified and fascinated in equal measure. Daniel used the proceeds to fund a charitable organization helping at-risk youth, trying, perhaps, to save others from the kind of corruption he'd experienced. He never married,
Never had children. Lived alone until his death in 1891, age 56. His final diary entry, found after his death, read simply, "I survived, but I never lived again."
Finch killed me in 1855. My body just took 36 years to realize it. The legacy, 4953. The Finch case sent shockwaves through Victorian Britain that lasted for decades. Within a month of Finch's execution, Parliament began debating new regulations for medical education. How had a professor been able to operate with such autonomy? How had no one noticed what he was doing? The Edinburgh Medical College implemented strict oversight of all private laboratories, required multiple faculty members to be present during cadaver work, mandated regular inspections. Similar reforms spread to universities across Britain. But the case's impact went far beyond institutional policy. It became a touchstone for debates about human nature, morality, and the limits of scientific inquiry. Philosophers cited it in discussions of moral relativism. Could morality truly be taught and untaught so easily? Were humans naturally good, corrupted by circumstance?
Or naturally neutral, shaped entirely by environment and influence?
Psychologists, a new field in the 1850s, studied it as a case of mass manipulation and cult dynamics. How had one man corrupted 7 others so completely? Criminologists examined it as one of the first documented cases of a teacher criminal, someone who didn't just commit crimes but systematically created other criminals. The case appeared in medical journals, philosophy texts, criminal law books. It was studied, analyzed, debated, and always the same questions emerged. Could this happen again?
How do we prevent it?
And are we certain we're truly different from those students? Because that was the deeply unsettling truth Finch had revealed. The students hadn't been monsters before they met him. They'd been ordinary young men, bright, ambitious, vulnerable in different ways, yes, but not evil. Finch had made them into monsters, which meant anyone could be made into a monster with the right pressure, the right manipulation, the right teacher. History would prove Finch's theory horrifyingly prescient. In 1871, a case emerged in Germany with striking similarities. A physician who'd manipulated students into assisting with murders for medical research. In 1924, the Leopold and Loeb case in Chicago demonstrated how two intelligent young men could be corrupted into murder through intellectual justification and mutual reinforcement. In 1961, the Milgram obedience experiments showed that ordinary people would administer what they believed were lethal shocks to strangers simply because an authority figure told them to. In 1971, the Stanford prison experiment demonstrated how quickly normal college students could become abusive guards or broken prisoners when given roles and permission. Over and over, throughout history, Finch's dark lesson was confirmed. Humans are capable of extraordinary evil when given justification, authority, and social permission. Morality is not innate. It's learned, maintained, and fragile. And the distance between civilized human and monster is far shorter than we'd like to believe. Today, more than 160 years after Professor Alister Finch's execution, his case remains disturbingly relevant. We've seen it in cult leaders who convince followers to commit murder, in terrorist recruiters who transform ordinary young people into extremists, in online radicalization that turns isolated individuals into killers. The tactics Finch used, isolation, intellectual seduction, gradual boundary erosion, creation of in-group identity, justification through higher purpose, these are the same tactics used by every successful manipulator throughout history. The student's progression from curiosity to boundary, crossing to addiction to full participation, mirrors the pattern we see in culty, indoctrination abuse cycles, and radicalization pipelines. Finch's case teaches us several uncomfortable truths. First, intelligence is not protection against corruption. All 7 students were bright, educated, rational young men. Their intelligence made them more vulnerable, not less, because they could construct elaborate justifications for their actions. Second, good people can do monstrous things. The students weren't inherently evil. They were lonely, ambitious, searching for belonging and purpose. Finch gave them that at a terrible price. Third, moral boundaries must be actively maintained. The students didn't suddenly become cannibalistic murderers. They took small steps, each one seemingly justified, each one making the next step easier. By the time they realized how far they'd gone, turning back felt impossible. Fourth, authority figures have immense power to corrupt. The students trusted Finch, admired him, wanted his approval. That trust became a weapon he used to destroy them. Fifth, isolation enables atrocity. Finch deliberately isolated his students, creating a secret circle, demanding absolute discretion, separating them psychologically from normal society. Once isolated, they had only each other to validate or challenge their actions, and they chose validation. These lessons echo through modern cases when we ask, how could those people do that? Whether about cult members, war criminals, corporate fraudsters, or any other group that commits collective evil, the answer is often the same. one step at a time, with justification, with authority, with group reinforcement, with isolation from outside moral reference points, just like Finch's students. The question we must ask ourselves is this: given the right circumstances, the right pressure, the right manipulative authority figure, would we be different? Would we recognize the manipulation? Would we resist the gradual erosion of our moral boundaries? Would we be willing to stand alone against group pressure, to reject authority, to face the consequences of breaking from the circle? Or would we, like Edmund and James and Peter and Richard and Daniel, find ourselves going along, taking one more step, justifying one more transgression, until we wake up one day and realize we've become something we never intended to be? Finch believed the answer was no, that humans are fundamentally weak, fundamentally corruptible, fundamentally capable of any evil given the right conditions. The uncomfortable truth is that history keeps proving him right, but history also shows us the alternative. Daniel Thorne broke free. It nearly destroyed him, but he broke free. He recognized what he'd become and chose to stop, even knowing it would cost him everything. That choice, the choice to resist, to break from the group, to accept consequences rather than continue down a dark path, that's the choice that defines us, not our capacity for evil. We're all capable of that, but our willingness to resist it, to recognize it in ourselves, to choose differently even when it's agonizing to do. So that's the real lesson of the Finch case, not that humans are monsters, but that we have the capacity to become
monsters and the responsibility to recognize and resist that capacity in ourselves every single day. Professor Alister.
Finch died on June 3rd, 1855, convinced he'd revealed a fundamental truth about human nature. 7 young men's lives were destroyed in his quest to prove that. Truth 8, innocent victims died to feed his addiction and his research, and 170 years later, we're still grappling with the questions his case raised. Are we truly civilized? Or are we savages wearing the mask of civilization, waiting for someone to give us permission to remove it? The answer, perhaps, is both. We contain the capacity for both extraordinary goodness and extraordinary evil. Which one we become depends on the choices we make, the influences we accept, and the boundaries we refuse to cross. Finch chose darkness and brought 7 others with him. Daniel Thorne chose to step back from that darkness,
even knowing the cost, every day in ways large and small.
We make similar choices. The question is, which choice will we make?
And will we recognize the moment when we're being tested?
Because if history has taught us anything, it's this. The next Professor Finch is already out there. The only question is whether we'll become his students, or whether we'll be the ones who walk away.